The abandoned hospital on the outskirts of our foggy town has always been a looming shadow over our lives, a silent monolith watching the slow rotation of the seasons from behind its green cage. Hidden behind a dense, almost impenetrable forest of centuries-old black pines whose thick branches blocked out nearly all natural light, it stands as a grim reminder of the past. Built in the early 20th century as a state-of-the-art medical center for treating complex neurological diseases, it once inspired awe and a strange, sickly hope among those who traveled for miles around seeking answers that regular medicine couldn't provide. However, by the late 70s, its pristine reputation completely crumbled into dust. Dark, unsettling rumors began to circulate among the locals, spoken only in hushed whispers at dinner tables. Stories about cruel, unauthorized experiments conducted behind locked doors and patients who vanished without a trace within the labyrinth of the closed wards. The final blow came on a freezing November night in 1982, a date etched forever into the memory of the town. Without any howling sirens, public warnings, or explanation, the entire staff and all patients were hastily evacuated in the middle of the night. The heavy iron gates were locked with thick, rusted chains, and the ground floor windows were boarded up tight with heavy timber. Since then, the massive brick building has been left to slowly decay under the weight of time. Nature aggressively reclaimed its territory. Thick, choking vines of poison ivy entangled the brickwork like veins, and powerful roots broke through the surrounding asphalt, tearing up the old parking lots. The hospital became a local legend, a terrifying monument to a forgotten catastrophe, guarded by an absolute, dead silence that kept even the bravest teenagers away. For many long months, I obsessively planned this expedition, studying old newspaper clippings and trying to piece together what lay inside. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, a digital camera, and a faded, torn copy of the building's original floor plan, I crossed the edge of the dark forest exactly at the moment when the dim autumn sun finally disappeared behind the horizon. The trek through the woods to the clinic was exhausting, forcing me to climb over fallen trunks and push through thorny brush. The air grew unnaturally dense as I drew closer, saturated with the pungent, choking smell of rotting leaves, wet moss, and damp earth. When the grim, towering facade suddenly emerged from the milky fog like a ghost ship, a prickly chill ran down my spine, making every hair on my arm stand up. The black voids of the glassless windows resembled the empty eye sockets of a giant skull, staring blankly into the night. Bypassing the rotting main porch where the steps had collapsed into a pile of splinters, I combed the perimeter until I managed to find a narrow semi-basement window that was only partially blocked by a broken board. Barely squeezing through the tight opening, my heart hammering against my ribs, I dropped down and landed on the cold concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud, finding myself completely engulfed in the pitch-black darkness of the hospital archive. The air inside was stagnant, heavy, and foul, making it difficult to breathe. It smelled intensely of damp mold, old waterlogged paper, and a faint metallic scent of rust that coated the back of my throat. Sweeping the narrow beam of my flashlight across the immense room, I saw rows of crooked, collapsing metal shelving stretching into the dark. Medical records, old charts, and patient files were scattered everywhere across the floor, long turned into a shapeless, swollen mush by decades of unchecked moisture and roof leaks. Moving past the ruined archive, I carefully navigated through the piles of debris and scattered plaster, eventually finding the grand staircase that led upward. The main hall on the first floor felt overwhelmingly oppressive, the ceiling stretching high up into shadows where grand chandeliers used to hang. The checkered floor tiles had swollen and buckled from the dampness, forming dangerous, uneven waves that made walking treacherous. Right in the center of the vast room lay an overturned wheelchair, its metal frame heavily rusted and its rubber tires rotted away. The silence here was suffocating, a heavy weight that seemed to press against my ears, broken only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep in the building and an icy draft that occasionally rustled the plastic sheets and debris on the floor. As I walked down the long, decaying corridor of the East Wing, checking the empty doorways of former patient rooms, I heard it, a rhythmic, wet dragging sound approaching rapidly from the darkness ahead. It sounded like something heavy being pulled across the grit of the concrete floor. I pointed my flashlight straight down the hall, my hand trembling, and froze in absolute terror. A hunched, emaciated figure wearing the rotted, tattered rags of hospital pajamas emerged from the gloom. His face was completely obscured behind a greasy, matted veil of gray hair, but his wild, wide eyes caught the sharp beam of my light and reflected it back. He let out a dull, guttural, animalistic roar that echoed off the concrete walls and suddenly lunged toward me, dropping to all fours and moving with a frustratingly unnatural, spider-like speed. Panic flared through my veins with paralyzing force, snapping me out of my trance. I spun around on my heel and dashed blindly back down the corridor, desperately searching for any open doorway or exit. My heart hammered violently in my chest, the adrenaline flooding my system as the frantic pounding of my own boots mixed with the terrifying, rapid scraping sounds of my pursuer gaining ground right behind me. I realized a second too late that in my blind panic, I had made a wrong turn and gone down a completely dead-end wing of the building. There were no side doors I could open, and the walls closed in on me, leaving nothing but a single window at the very end of the hall that was only partially boarded up with old plywood. With absolutely no time to think or look for another route, I launched my entire body at the small opening. Ignoring the protruding rusty nails and the jagged shards of broken glass still clinging to the frame, I forcefully squeezed through the narrow gap. My jacket tore loudly on a piece of metal, and a sharp edge of a wooden board sliced deeply into my shoulder, but the massive surge of adrenaline completely masked the physical pain. Tumbling out into the cold night air, I landed heavily on a thick, soft pile of rotting leaves, rolling over once before immediately springing back to my feet. I ran blindly through the pitch-black forest, not caring about the path, branches whipping hard against my face and tearing at my clothes as I sprinted through the trees. Glancing back over my shoulder for a split second, I saw the massive shape of the hospital being swallowed up by the thick fog, looking once again like a dead, harmless piece of cold stone resting under the stars. The hollow pounding of the blood in my temples reminded me of the very real, terrifying danger hiding inside those walls. I didn't stop running, my lungs burning and my breath coming in ragged gasps, until the comforting, saving yellow streetlights of our quiet town finally appeared through the distant tree trunks, signaling that I was safe. It all started about 5 years ago. My family unexpectedly inherited an old, long empty house after the death of my great-uncle named Arthur. He was an incredibly eccentric man, a true hermit who spent the last 30 years of his life in a tiny, almost deserted village. This place cannot be found on most modern maps. The village was located in a deep lowland, surrounded on all sides by a dense, impenetrable forest that the locals called Blackwood. It was one of those forests where light penetrates with great difficulty due to the tightly woven crowns of centuries-old trees, and the silence inside feels unnatural, almost pressing on your eardrums. My grandfather's house stood on the very outskirts, like a border between civilization and wild nature. My parents decided it was a great opportunity to spend the summer away from the city bustle, do some cosmetic repairs, and subsequently sell the property at a profit. We arrived there in mid-July. The house was a 2-story Victorian building with peeling gray paint, a sagging porch, and windows that looked like black gaps against the bright sky. Inside, it smelled of dampness, old dust, and something vaguely sweet, resembling the scent of decaying autumn leaves. All the furniture was covered with white sheets yellowed by time, which gave the rooms the resemblance of a morgue full of silent silhouettes. On the second day of our stay, my father had an emergency at work. He and my mom had to urgently leave back to the city for a few days, leaving me alone. I was a fairly independent teenager, happy to have the opportunity to live without parental control, enjoying solitude, books, and video games. The nearest neighbors were a mile away from us. Cell service only worked in the attic, and even then with major interruptions, and the only source of information was an old radio in the kitchen. The first day alone went completely peacefully. I was cleaning the first floor, sorting through old things in the living room, and trying to get used to the constant creaking of the floorboards that the house made with every gust of wind. But as dusk fell, the atmosphere around began to subtly change. The Blackwood forest, starting literally right behind our backyard, seemed to come alive, but not with the usual sounds of nature, rather with some thick, ominous silence. The singing of birds disappeared, the chirping of insects could not be heard. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, I was sitting in a chair by the window, illuminated only by a dim desk lamp, and reading. Suddenly, my attention was caught by a barely noticeable movement behind the glass. On the border of light and darkness, right where the first trees began, stood a tall, unnaturally elongated silhouette. It blended in with the shadows of the trunks, but its proportions were completely wrong. Its arms seemed too long, almost reaching the ground, and its head was tilted to the side at an unnatural angle. My heart sank to my heels. I instantly turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and froze, not even daring to breathe. The silhouette didn't move for long minutes, and then it simply dissolved into the darkness, as if it had never been there. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, locking all the doors twice, checking every window latch, and arming myself with a heavy fireplace poker. I convinced myself that it was just a play of light and shadow, an optical illusion caused by exhaustion and paranoia. In the morning, under the bright sunlight, my fears did indeed seem ridiculous. Deciding to distract myself from bad thoughts, I went to the attic to find a box of old comics my parents had promised me. The attic was the dustiest place in the house, cluttered with broken chairs, old trunks, and bundles of yellowed newspapers. In the farthest corner, under a piece of tarp, I found a heavy wooden crate locked with a simple padlock. The lock gave way after a few strikes with a hammer. There were no comics inside. The crate was packed to the brim with Arthur's diaries. The pages were covered in tiny, trembling handwriting, and between the text nestled frightening, chaotic drawings. They depicted tall figures among the trees, strange symbols resembling intertwined branches, and repeatedly drawn sketches of eyes lacking pupils. At the very bottom of the crate lay several strange amulets woven from blackened twigs, feathers, and small bones, apparently belonging to birds or small rodents. The horror slowly but surely began to return, paralyzing my movements and making my blood run cold. The second night began with a sharp deterioration in the weather. A thick, impenetrable fog rolled in from the forest, enveloping the house in a dense gray shroud. The temperature in the rooms dropped rapidly, and little clouds of steam escaped from my mouth when I exhaled. Around midnight, the old wiring gave out, and the power went off in the entire house. I was sitting in my bedroom on the second floor, wrapped in several blankets, clutching a dim flashlight in my hands. And that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. They were heavy, slow, and completely arrhythmic thuds, as if the creature stepping on the boards had trouble carrying its own body weight or had limbs of different lengths. The footsteps moved along the facade, then came a quiet, scratching sound against the glass of the living room on the first floor. The scratching grew louder, more methodical, until it escalated into a continuous scraping of something incredibly sharp and hard against the window frame. Uncontrollable shivering gripped my body. I slid off the bed and huddled in the far corner of the room, hiding behind a massive oak wardrobe. The sounds downstairs stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. A few moments later, the house shuddered from a massive blow to the back door. The lock groaned pitifully, the wood cracked. The blows repeated with mechanical regularity, each time harder and more furious. Suddenly, there was the sound of shattering glass, and a heavy thud crashed onto the first floor floorboards. Something had gotten inside. I could clearly hear its breathing, hoarse, wet, accompanied by a quiet gurgling sound with every inhale. A sickening smell of rotting leaves, damp earth, and rust began to spread through the air. The creature moved slowly through the rooms, overturning furniture and throwing things onto the floor. Then the footsteps approached the stairs. The boards creaked under the unnaturally heavy weight. It was coming upstairs, straight towards my room. I turned off the flashlight, squeezed my eyes shut until it hurt, and wrapped my arms around my head, praying to all known gods for salvation. The door handle of my bedroom slowly turned, but the lock, which I had prudently engaged earlier that evening, held. The creature stopped right outside the door. I could feel its presence, could sense the ice-cold chill radiating from it, seeping through the cracks in the floor. A loud, drawn-out hiss echoed, followed by a blow of incredible force against the door panel. The wood splintered, but the door stood strong. The creature continued to stand in the hallway for long, unbearable hours, periodically scratching its claws against the wood and making low, guttural sounds that made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. Only when the first rays of the morning sun began to pierce through the gaps in the blinds did the footsteps finally retreat. I heard the creature go downstairs and leave the house through the broken window, disappearing into the blackwood forest. I sat in my hiding spot for about 2 more hours, waiting for full daylight. Making sure the house was absolutely quiet, I grabbed my backpack, jumped out of the second-floor window onto the roof of the extension, and from there climbed down to the ground. I ran down the dirt road without looking back, ignoring the pain in my lungs and my bleeding feet. I ran for almost 5 miles until I reached the nearest gas station in the town of Oakville. There I was finally able to call my parents. I never returned to that village again. My parents, discovering the damage to the house, wrote it all off as wild animals or vandals, hired workers for repairs, and quickly sold the property for a pittance. They never believed my version of events. Arthur's diaries, the strange amulets, and the memories of the unnatural silhouette remained nothing more than my personal nightmare. If you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, in places where light does not penetrate and where an unnatural silence reigns, remember that you might not be alone. Some secrets are better left unsolved, and some doors forever locked. My move wasn't a spontaneous adventure. It was a forced escape from financial problems, creditors blowing up my phone, and severe burnout that left me feeling completely defeated. When the lawyer informed me that my late grandfather had left me an old house in a remote forested area, I grabbed onto this chance like a drowning man clutching at a straw. I packed my few belongings into an old, battered pickup truck and headed north, hoping to wait out the worst of times, get my thoughts in order, and possibly renovate the house for a future sale. The place turned out to be an absolute dump, as if frozen in time. The area was just a few miles of broken dirt road disappearing into a dense, dark forest where the tree canopy barely let any sunlight through. The nearest town with a working grocery store, gas station, and police precinct was 40 miles away. Cell service dropped out right as I exited the highway. My phone turned into a useless piece of plastic. The house itself turned out to be a massive, dilapidated wooden structure hidden behind a wall of centuries-old pines. Its porch was sagging, and the paint had long since peeled away. The nearest neighbors lived half a mile away, and their lots looked just as lifeless and abandoned. I was completely alone, left with nothing but the creaking of old floorboards and the howling wind, cut off from civilization. The first few days were spent clearing the house of layers of dust, cobwebs, and trash. I worked from dawn till dusk, rubbing my hands raw, and slept like a log on the old couch in the living room, not even having the energy to undress. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing details that sent an unpleasant chill down my spine. At first, it was just little things that were easy to brush off as absent-mindedness. I clearly remembered leaving a jar of coffee on the kitchen counter near the sink, but in the morning, I found it on the windowsill across the room. Then, canned food started disappearing from the pantry, along with batteries for my flashlight. I blamed it on my own exhaustion and stress, convincing myself I had just forgotten where I put them, or that the house had some really large rats. But on the fifth day, a heavy rain fell, turning the ground around the house into thick, squelching mud. Stepping out onto the porch in the morning to get some fresh air, I saw footprints. They were deep, clear prints of heavy work boots leading from the edge of the woods straight to my windows. The tracks stopped at every ground floor window, as if someone had stood there a long time in the pouring rain, pressing their face to the glass and peering inside. The shoe size was noticeably larger than mine. Water was still pooling in the heel indentations. The guest had been here very recently. Someone was closely studying my home. My paranoia skyrocketed. I walked through the entire house, frantically checking every lock and latch. The only place I hadn't been yet was the basement. The door leading down was in the kitchen and was secured with a heavy padlock. I should have immediately been alarmed by the fact that the lock looked completely brand new. Heavy, shiny metal without a single speck of rust, which sharply contrasted with everything else in this rotting house. Armed with a heavy crowbar and taking a deep breath, I snapped the lock's shackle. The door creaked open, and out of the darkness wafted not the usual basement dampness, but a sharp, nauseating stench of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and spoiled food. I clicked on a high-powered flashlight, tightened my grip on the crowbar, and slowly began descending the creaky wooden stairs, expecting someone to lunge at me at any moment. There were no monsters or ghosts down there. There was someone's secret life. In the corner of the basement lay a dirty, stained mattress, littered with empty beer cans and cigarette butts. Nearby stood a small gas heater and a crate holding the exact canned goods that had gone missing from my pantry. But the most terrifying thing was on a makeshift table made from old wooden pallets. My things were lying there. The spare keys to my pickup truck that I had left in the hallway on my very first day, my old wallet, and several Polaroid photographs. I picked up the photos with trembling hands, feeling nausea rising in my throat. The first one showed me chopping wood in the backyard in the bright sunlight. The second was of my pickup truck, with the license plate clearly visible, and the third photo was taken at night. There was no flash, but the dim moonlight falling through the window was enough to make out the scene. It was me, sleeping on the couch in the living room, covered with a blanket. The picture had been taken from arm's length. Someone wasn't just living in my basement. This someone regularly and silently crept upstairs while I was defenseless in my sleep, stood over me and watched. Before I could fully process the horror of the situation or drop the photos, I heard a noise outside. A car door slammed. Then came heavy, confident footsteps on the wooden porch and a rough male voice throwing out some phrase. Someone immediately replied. There were at least 2 of them. I froze in the basement, instantly switching off the flashlight. The footsteps moved into the hallway, then into the kitchen. The floor above me creaked menacingly. I heard a sharp, angry curse. They had seen the broken lock on the basement door. They realized I had found their hideout, and that I was somewhere nearby. Panic set in. I heard one of them run into the living room with a heavy tread, loudly overturning furniture and slamming doors, while the second one began stomping heavily down the stairs into the basement. I didn't have a firearm, only the cold iron crowbar in my sweaty palms. In the pitch darkness, I wedged myself behind an old, massive heating boiler in the furthest corner, pressed my back against the freezing wall, and tried to breathe so quietly I wouldn't hear my own heartbeat. The beam of a powerful tactical flashlight sliced through the basement's darkness. The man was breathing heavily, stepping slowly and methodically, lighting up the corners. He passed literally 3 feet from me. I could smell the sour stench of alcohol, sweat, and damp, dirty clothes. I saw the edge of his heavy boot, the exact same one that had left prints under my windows. At that moment, a triumphant shout rang out from upstairs. The second man had found my backpack with my documents in the bedroom and was loudly calling for his partner. The man with the flashlight cursed filthily, kicked an empty beer can, and quickly ran back upstairs. It was my one tiny chance. As soon as his footsteps faded on the second floor, I slipped out from behind the boiler, trying not to scrape the rusty pipes, silently flew up the stairs to the kitchen, and dashed toward the back door. I didn't waste precious seconds looking for my things or my jacket. The car keys were already in my pocket. I had instinctively grabbed them when I took them off the table in the basement. I bolted out into the freezing, pouring rain. In the driveway, blocking the exit, sat an old, rusted van with no license plates. I rushed to my pickup, slipping on the wet grass, praying to all the gods that the old engine wouldn't fail me right now. My hands were shaking so violently that I missed the ignition 3 times, scratching the plastic. Just then, the front door of the house was kicked open, and the 2 men burst onto the porch. In the van's headlights, I saw one of them raising a long-barreled hunting rifle. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally roared to life. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The pickup swerved dangerously in the slippery mud, nearly crashing into a tree, but by some miracle, the tires gripped the solid dirt. A deafening gunshot rang out, tearing through the noise of the rain. My truck's side mirror shattered with a crack, showering the cabin with glass. I instinctively ducked down to the steering wheel, turning it until my knuckles turned white, swerved past the van onto the shoulder, and flew onto the dirt road leading away from the property. I was tearing down the road at a speed that threw the old vehicle side to side near the drop-off, expecting every second to see the headlights of my pursuers in the surviving rearview mirror, but they didn't follow me. I didn't slow down or stop until I reached a lit highway and made it to the police station in the nearest major city. As detectives later found out, the estate had long been taken over by a group of violent, marginalized squatters who ran a burglary ring in the neighboring county and were hiding from the law in the woods. When they found out the abandoned house suddenly had a legal owner, they initially decided to just quietly intimidate me into leaving. But when I stuck my nose into their business and found their lair, they tried to get rid of the witness for good. The police conducted a raid with a SWAT team, but by the time they reached the property, the van had vanished without a trace, and the basement had been completely scrubbed of evidence. They even took the mattress with them. I never returned to that cursed house, neither for my remaining belongings nor to assess the damage. Through my lawyer, the lot was sold for pennies to a local logging company. Now I live in a bustling city, on a high floor in an apartment with a heavy metal door and the best security system I could afford. But sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night to the slightest noise in the hallway, I look into the dark corner of my bedroom and remember, down to the smallest detail, that Polaroid photo taken in the dark right above my sleeping face. The irrational fear of imaginary monsters under the bed fades with age. The real, sticky, maddening terror comes when you realize just how vulnerable you are and what other people are capable of. I don't know why I even went there in the first place. Probably out of sheer boredom or a stupid desire to get a thrill on a weekend evening. Now the reasons don't matter at all, because that day forever divided my life into before and after. The fact remains, on a warm summer evening, I found myself completely alone in front of the huge, multi-layered rusty wrought iron gates of an old abandoned hospital. There were the most creepy and repulsive rumors about this giant building in our region, mostly related to the fact that the clinic was closed suddenly and hastily, leaving almost all the equipment inside. The clinic was located off the beaten path, in the deepest part of a dark, impenetrable forest, where even on a clear day sunlight barely broke through. The drive there took several hours along a completely ruined dirt road, and when I finally killed the engine of my car on the overgrown shoulder, the sun had already begun to rapidly set behind the tops of the century-old trees. The 6-story brick building loomed over me like some ancient, ugly behemoth that had fallen into a heavy slumber. All the window frames had long been broken out and gaped with black voids, and thick, twisting roots of wild ivy grew densely through deep cracks in the load-bearing walls. The wind roamed freely through the empty, endless corridors, creating a low, whistling, and vibrating hum that immediately sent an unpleasant, icy chill down my spine. The main front doors turned out to be tightly boarded up with thick rotten planks, crisscrossed with rusty chains, and blocked by mountains of dirty construction debris. I spent about half an hour pushing through stinging, thorny bushes and tall, almost waist-high, dry grass to the backyard. There, almost at ground level, I found a half-broken window leading straight into the dark basement technical rooms. Turning on my powerful, heavy flashlight and pulling a thick respirator over my face, so as not to inhale the toxic, century-old dust and black mold spores, I extremely cautiously jumped down into the unknown. The basement met me with a grave-like cold that pierced to the bone and the booming, multiple echoes of my own heavy footsteps. The air here was incredibly stuffy, dense, with a distinct, sickening smell of rusted metal and Swedish, years-old rot. The beam of my flashlight slowly snatched peeling, damp walls out of the thick darkness, from which old paint hung in long, dirty shreds. Small broken glass, pieces of crumbling plaster, and some unidentified rotting medical waste constantly and loudly crunched under the thick rubber soles of my boots. I moved as slowly as possible along the long, winding, gut-like concrete tunnel, periodically taking pictures with my camera. A blinding white flash would catch ugly rusty pipes hanging from the sagging ceiling out of the gloom for a tiny fraction of a second, looking like the exposed insides of a huge dead mechanism. Faded plaques covered with fluffy fungus hung crookedly on the dirty walls. Morgue, boiler room, chemical storage. Soon I found myself in the huge, spacious room of the former main boiler room. Cyclopean-sized, pot-bellied metal furnaces stood along the walls, completely covered with a thick layer of red scale. Somewhere in the farthest corner of the room, water dripped steadily with an irritating rhythm. This ringing sound, echoing multiple times off the bare concrete walls, created an extremely frightening and unpleasant illusion of someone else's presence. I constantly felt, every single second, that someone was standing right behind my back, but every time I abruptly turned around, the beam of light only caught clouds of gray dust kicked up by my footsteps. Suppressing a growing, sticky feeling of inexplicable anxiety, I found the exit from the boiler room and stumbled upon a wide, chipped staircase leading up. The first floor amazed with its scale, entirely disproportionate to a human. The main front foyer turned out to be strewn with thousands of yellowed, rotting medical records. They covered the cracked, small-tiled floor in a solid carpet that rustled loudly underfoot. Through a thick layer of sticky gray dirt, you could make out the faded diagnoses of long-dead people. Next to the massive, half-destroyed reception desk sat a lonely, overturned wheelchair with a torn leatherette seat. In the very weak rays of the fading sun, which barely broke through the boarded-up cracks in the windows, hung dust so thick that the flashlight beam seemed almost like a tangible, solid pillar of light. Passing the foyer, I headed deep into the building, to the wing where the surgical and operating blocks used to be. Endless corridors were densely lined with abandoned medical gurneys with squeaky, tightly rusted wheels. Heavy doors to former treatment rooms were wide open. In one of the spacious operating rooms, right in the middle, stood a massive metal table, over which ominously hung a huge multi-bulb lamp with mangled and broken mirror reflectors. On the white-tiled floor, right under the table itself, huge dark, almost black, long-dried stains of unknown origin were clearly visible. The very atmosphere of this place became more oppressive and unbearable with every minute spent there. For some reason, the air became unnaturally, incredibly cold, although it was still a warm, stuffy evening outside. My fingers gripping the plastic of the camera body began to noticeably go numb from this grave-like cold. Climbing the crumbling, dangerous stairs to the third floor, I found myself in the area of the closed ward for the most severely ill patients. For some reason, the windows here were tightly bricked up, so not a single, even the weakest ray of street light penetrated inside. Absolute, physically ear-pressing gloom reigned. My reliable, expensive flashlight, fully charged before the trip, suddenly began to flicker rhythmically and strangely. The spot of light became either barely smoldering or suddenly flashed blindingly bright. At the very end of this incredibly long hospital corridor, disappearing into the darkness, at the entrance to a block secured by heavy grates, I caught sight of something completely inexplicable out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It absolutely did not fall from any of the randomly scattered pieces of furniture. It was an unbearably tall, inhumanly elongated, grotesquely distorted silhouette that seemed to perfectly blend with the dense darkness of the peeling walls, but at the same time seemed blacker than absolute darkness itself. I stopped abruptly, frozen dead in my tracks. My breath was instantly cut off by a harsh spasm. The shadow did not move at all, did not make a sound, but I felt with all my skin, with every nerve cell, a piercing, bone-chilling cold emanating from it. With shaking, disobedient hands, I raised the heavy camera and reflexively pressed the shutter button. A powerful double flash bathed the entire corridor in harsh white light for a brief moment, and in that microscopic fraction of a second, I clearly saw that there was no one at the end of the corridor. It was empty, but as soon as this saving light faded and pitch darkness closed in again, this creepy, impossible silhouette appeared a good 10 meters closer to me without a single sound. An animalistic, completely uncontrollable primal panic washed over me in a heavy, suffocating wave. My survival instinct screamed frantically about imminent danger. I began to back away very slowly, not daring to take my terror-widened gaze away from that spot. The temperature of the stale air dropped so sharply that with every ragged exhale, thick white clouds of steam began to burst from my mouth. My flashlight blinked pitifully with a crackle for the last time, clicked quietly inside, and died completely, leaving me in pitch black, ringing blindness. And at that exact moment, a sound rang out. It wasn't the creaking of old window frames. It was a disgusting, wet, loud shuffling sound of something incredibly bulky and heavy that was dragging itself very slowly, with visible effort, across the dirty floor straight towards me. This nauseating sound was accompanied by a quiet, but extremely distinct metallic scraping, as if someone with incredible force was dragging long, sharp claws along the brick wall of the corridor. I spun on my heels and bolted as fast as I could. In blind panic, I rushed through the black, tangled corridors in absolute darkness, constantly tripping over abandoned objects, slamming my shoulders hard against invisible door frames. My heart pounded with such monstrous force that the beats echoed painfully in my temples. I felt with my whole being how something unspeakably creepy and malicious was inexorably approaching from behind. The shuffling sound grew louder and unbearably clearer. It relentlessly followed right on my heels, not lagging a single step behind. I flew onto the stairwell like a bullet and nearly tumbled headlong down to the second floor, scraping my palms raw and bloody against the walls. Only one thought pulsed in my buzzing head: to get out alive. Finding myself on the first floor, I took a wrong turn in my disorientation and suddenly slammed chest first into the tightly locked, moisture-swollen heavy wooden doors of the old archive. I had hit a dead end. The shuffling and the clanking of claws behind me abruptly cut off. Absolute, unnatural, deafening dead silence fell, making my ears pop. The air became so dense, viscous, and icy that it physically hurt to inhale it. I felt the heavy presence of something infinitely terrifying right behind my back, literally a couple of centimeters away. The hair on the back of my neck instantly stood on end. Not even daring to try and look back, I fumbled with shaking fingers in my jacket pocket, found a tiny emergency keychain flashlight, and pressed the button with all my might. A weak, trembling, dim blue light snatched a very narrow side technical passageway from the darkness, leading to a service staircase. With all my remaining strength, I lunged there, miraculously keeping my footing on the slippery floor. The descent back into the flooded basement felt like a true eternity. I made my way through the boiler room almost blindly, frantically orienting myself only by a faint, pale strip of moonlight breaking through that very same broken window. Every moment it seemed to me that invisible icy fingers were about to close in a death grip around my neck. Pulling myself up on trembling arms, I threw myself out of the concrete window, falling heavily into the tall grass wet with dew. The fresh night air of the forest, which had seemed sinister just recently, now felt like the most desired salvation in the whole wide world. I instantly jumped to my feet and, without looking at the path, ran towards the saving fence, never once daring to look back. Roughly vaulting over the high fence, I rushed to my car, frantically pulling out my jingling keys. Jumping into the cabin and starting the engine on the first try, I flicked on the high beams and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The car roared away, leaving those rusty gates and the giant clinic building far behind. Only after driving several dozen kilometers down the highway, when the yellow lights of the nearest town finally appeared on the horizon, did I risk looking at the screen of my camera. In the very last photo, taken with a flash in that dark third-floor corridor, there was absolutely nothing visible except for empty peeling walls and a dirty floor. No creepy shadow, no tall elongated silhouette. But in the very top right corner of the frame, on the damp cracked concrete ceiling, fresh, incredibly deep jagged grooves were clearly visible, from which thick, pitch-black liquid was dripping in large, heavy drops straight onto the floor. I never picked up a camera again in my life and permanently deleted all coordinates of such places from my navigator. In our foggy, perpetually damp town, people always tried not to speak aloud about what loomed on the northern hill. The abandoned psychiatric clinic had been rotting for decades among the dense pine forest, frightening locals with the black voids of its broken windows and gloomy Gothic architecture. The building had acquired a notorious reputation, and even teenagers, usually prone to foolish tests of courage, bypassed this place. But for my friend, this facility held incredible value. He was an obsessed documentary photographer who had dedicated his life to finding beauty in decay and ruin. He was drawn to places abandoned by humanity, where nature was slowly taking back its own. Exactly a year ago, he gathered his heavy equipment and set off for the clinic to shoot a series of photos for his portfolio. Since that gloomy autumn day, no one has seen him. The police organized a massive search operation that lasted for several long weeks. Canine units combed every square meter of the surrounding forest. Rescuers with powerful spotlights descended into the deep basements and ventilation shafts of the building, and drones with thermal imagers were launched into the sky. It was all absolutely in vain. Not a single trace, not a shred of clothing, not a piece of abandoned gear was found. It was as if my friend had been erased from the very fabric of reality. The case was eventually closed, reclassifying him as a missing person, but this mystery poisoned my mind. I couldn't accept the unknown, and a year after the official searches ended, I decided to go to the clinic myself to find some answers. My path to the clinic led through a dense thicket, where old trees intertwined their branches, almost completely blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder and damper as I approached the massive wrought iron gates. The building loomed over me like a giant block of stone. The main entrance was tightly sealed with concrete blocks, so I had to find an alternative route. Skirting the east wing through tall, wet grass, I discovered a rusted fire escape leading to a slightly open second-floor window. The structure creaked and swayed dangerously under my weight, but the iron rungs held. Pulling myself up, I tumbled through the rotten window frame and found myself inside. The sensory shock was immediate. A thick, suffocating stench of black mold, rotting wood, and old medications hit my nose. An absolute, ringing silence hung inside, which didn't just surround me, but felt like a dense substance pressing against my eardrums. My inventory was extremely simple: a powerful tactical flashlight, spare batteries, a strong nylon rope, and a survival knife. Turning on the light, I illuminated a long corridor. The paint on the walls was peeling, hanging in long, dirty strips, and the floor was littered with broken glass and chunks of fallen plaster. I was standing in the former surgical block. Every step I took echoed dully in the empty spaces. I slowly moved forward, passing abandoned wards. Inside, chaos reigned. Overturned metal beds with decaying mattresses, shattered glass cabinets, torn medical records covered in a thick layer of gray dust. In the intensive care unit, the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The temperature here dropped so much that my breath began turning into thick white vapor. The The sensation of a heavy, alien gaze on my back forced me to constantly look over my shoulder, my flashlight beam catching only empty corners and rusty gurneys. Past the surgical block, I found the main staircase and began my descent to the first floor, where, according to old blueprints, the main archive was located. The steps were covered in a thick layer of slippery moss. The archive was a colossal room with endless rows of leaning metal shelving units stretching far into the darkness. The floor was completely carpeted with yellowed folders and loose papers that crunched loudly under my boots. I methodically scanned the rows, hoping to find the slightest clue. And suddenly, on one of the bottom shelves, my light caught an object that absolutely did not fit into the surrounding ruin. It was a black, waterproof backpack. The exact same backpack my friend always took on his expeditions. The fabric was covered only by a thin layer of dust. My hands betrayed me with a tremble as I unzipped the stiff zipper. Inside lay a bottle of water, a compass, and the missing man's greatest treasure, his professional DSLR camera. The device's battery had miraculously retained a minimal charge. The indicator lit up with a faint red glow when I pressed the power button. I opened the digital gallery and began reviewing the most recently taken shots. The first few dozen photos captured exactly what I had seen myself: gloomy corridors, ruined wards, the interplay of light and shadow in empty window frames. But the further I scrolled, the more disturbing the images became. Starting with the photos taken on the basement level, a strange anomaly began to appear in the background. At first, it looked like a trick of the shadows or a sensor glitch, but in subsequent frames, the dark spot took on a shape. It was a tall, impossibly thin silhouette, woven entirely out of thick, impenetrable gloom. The creature was stalking the photographer through the flooded basement corridors. With every new picture, it was getting closer. The presumed finale of this horrifying photoshoot plunged me into uncontrollable terror. It was a blurry photo, taken with a flash in a cramped concrete room. My friend's face was contorted in a grimace of pure, primal fear, and reaching out from the darkness directly behind his back was a pale, skinless hand with disproportionately long, thin fingers. At that very moment, a sound shattered the dead silence of the vast archive. From the direction of the concrete stairs leading straight up from the basement came slow, heavy footsteps. Something massive and wet was coming up. It sounded as if chunks of raw meat were slapping against the stone. I instantly turned off my flashlight and wedged myself into the narrowest gap between two shelves, holding my breath. The footsteps relentlessly drew closer and finally stopped right at the entrance to the archive. In the dim moonlight filtering through the filthy windows, I saw this silhouette, the very same monster from the photographs. The creature moved in sharp, unnatural jerks, its long limbs dragging across the papers. It stopped near the spot where I had found the backpack, tilted its faceless head, and began to noisily draw in the air. Every second stretched into eternity. Then, the creature sharply turned around and, with a loud squelching sound, headed back down into the darkness of the basement. Waiting until the sounds finally faded deep below, I grabbed the camera and bolted. I ran through the dark corridors without looking where I was going, leaping over debris and risking broken legs. Escaping through the window onto the fire escape, I jumped into the wet grass and sprinted through the forest until my lungs started burning like fire and the silhouette of the clinic disappeared behind the trees. Returning to my safe apartment only by morning, I immediately extracted the memory card and inserted it into my laptop. Reviewing the files on a large screen, I discovered what I had missed in my panic: a hidden video file recorded right after the final photograph. The recording lasted only about 20 seconds and was made on the lowest level of the building, in the morgue. The camera was resting on the floor, filming the scene at a crooked angle. In the center of the frame stood my friend, his back turned to the lens. He was staring fixedly at the slightly open steel door of one of the body refrigerators. From this dark slit, defying gravity, a thick black substance resembling living tar was slowly seeping out. It moved across the floor, wrapping around his legs. He didn't try to run. He stood completely motionless, as if bound by an invisible paralysis. The black mass swiftly crawled up his body, completely enveloping and concealing his figure. In the final seconds of the video, this formless, pulsating darkness began to transform. It stretched upwards, its structure altering to form those same unnaturally long, broken limbs. At the very end of the recording, the newly formed tall, faceless silhouette slowly turned its smooth, light-absorbing head directly toward the camera lens. The puzzle pieces came together into one blood-chilling picture. The clinic wasn't just an abandoned building with ghosts. This place was a living organism that fed on careless explorers. It consumed them, digested their humanity, and turned them into its own guard dogs, forcing them to wander its rotting corridors forever. The creature I had hidden from in the archive, the monster forever seeking new victims in the dark, it wasn't an ancient demon. It was the missing photographer himself. And now, studying these frames in the safety of my own home, I realized with mounting horror that by taking his camera from the clinic, I had drawn the attention of this abyss upon myself.